I always thought that this 6th chapter of St. John's Gospel, which we've started last week and we will continue 4 weeks from now, finish 4 weeks from now, was placed here in the midst of this year when we're reading St. Mark every Sunday, because there wasn't enough material in St. Mark's Gospel for all the Sundays of the year, because it is a very short Gospel. And I've just discovered that that's not the reason we read St. John. There's plenty verses enough to fill out the year with St. Mark, but they chose to do differently when they compiled the lectionary, because this chapter is so important. And we don't have a year of reading St. John. John's Gospel only comes up during the high holy days, like during Lent and Easter and Advent. We don't have a year when we read it straight through, but this chapter is so important. But the problem with this chapter is that there's a lot of terminology in here which is completely different in our minds from what it was understood as in the days of Jesus. What's happening here is, if you remember last week, Jesus multiplied the bread and fed the crowd. And then they wanted to make him king, so he got in a boat and ran away, got away from them. They found him again, as we heard today. And they want to know why, how'd you get here? Which is rather irrelevant. And he says, you know, you're not looking for me for the right reasons. You're looking for me because you want a second helping. You want the meal done all over again today, and then the other people that gathered around who hadn't been at the multiplication of the loaves, they had heard about it and they wanted to get in there and get their food. But again, the whole mindset. In those days, food was scarce. There was no Kroger's in Palestine in the days of Jesus. I guarantee that. You lived very, very frugally because you couldn't store food very well. No refrigeration. So people lived day by day, getting their meals as they could. And of course, this bonanza with Jesus was this wonderful, all this bread. And bread was the staple crop, the staple food. People lived on bread. Occasionally they had a little meat. Sometimes they had vegetables, but day in and day out it was bread. Pita bread, I guess. Boring, huh? But most of the world still lives that way. On grain in one form or another, day in and day out. We're the only ones who live Kroger-like. So they're coming to him for a good reason. And he says to them, it's not the best reason. You should be coming to me because I am the bread of life. Now, all the Catholics start thinking, going to Holy Communion, going to Mass, receiving the Blessed Sacrament, having an hour of adoration before the tabernacle. Jesus is not talking about the sacrament of the Eucharist when he says, I am the bread of life. He's talking about himself. He's saying to these people, I am what sustains you day in and day out. I am what will sustain you day in and day out, provided you believe in me. They say to him, what work shall we do? What does God want us to do? Again, same mentality we have probably. What do I have to do to be saved? What do I have to do to go to heaven? What do I have to not do to go to heaven? In other words, the whole thing's under our control. We're still the center of the universe. I'll be saved because I do good. God will have to accept me. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And they say, what work shall we do? And he says, the only work required of you is to believe in me. Now there's another word which we have trouble with. When we believe in something, I believe in the Trinity. What's that mean? With my mind, I accept the idea that there are three persons in one God. Belief in the Bible, the word to believe in this day and age did not mean anything to do with your intellect. It had to do with your heart. If I believe in somebody, I commit myself to them. I start to think like they think. I take their interests first above my own. That's what belief meant in the time of Jesus. And even though we have to translate the ancient scriptures into English, we also have to remember to translate the meanings, because the same words don't have the same meanings. And so Jesus is saying to them, I am the bread of life. I will sustain you unto eventually unending life if you believe in me. Not just believe me, but believe in me. And that's what St. Paul was talking about in his letter here. He says, this is not the way you learned Christ, not with your head, but with your heart. It means living in the same way that Jesus lived, with the same mentality of Jesus, putting on the mind of Christ, St. Paul says elsewhere. Putting on Christ. If you've been to the Easter Vigil and saw what they do to the people who got baptized, they put a big white robe on them, right after their baptism. That's a symbol of putting on Christ, thinking like Christ, reacting and responding to the reality of your life the way Jesus responded to the reality of his own life. And then this is where you have to keep reading the scriptures. How did he respond to these people, to the goodies and the baddies and the indifferent and the torturers and the killers? So we're not anywhere near the Blessed Sacrament or the Eucharist in this reading. We will get there eventually, many, many verses later. But right now, and this is important for us, because the Eucharist is meaningless unless we believe in Jesus, of which the Eucharist is a sacramental sign. But unless we have come to grips with the person of Jesus in our own lives, then any sacrament is meaningless, because it would lead us nowhere unless we believe in him of which the sacraments are signs. So that's why I think this is placed here. Now I understand why it was placed here so conspicuously every third year, so that we will come to grips with the reality of Jesus before we even approach the sacramentality of Jesus.